stream just went good. Yay. See how long we can keep that. Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. Picture should change in just a second. I'm so glad to have folks here, and I know that occasionally there'll be more joining, especially because we have the folks. There we go. Hey, I hope everyone's holding up well. Two names I've heard this called by. One, I've called it the zombie apocalypse, just sort of affectionately, but there are no real zombies. And then the other thing that we've done is that my pastor refers to as Coromageddon. So I hope everyone's out there staying safe and doing well, and waiting for this to pass over, which is an ironic thing given the season that we are going through. Few little notes. As most churches are getting more cyber connected, my Sunday school class has been moved, and I am now broadcasting it so that you guys can join us for Leviticus on Sunday mornings. And that also will be on Facebook, so it will stay up for a while. I will post in the description of this video the URL for my Facebook site. And so that will give just something else you can join us for. And you can join some of the folks that will be joining us from Hillside Southern Baptist. So that's a new thing. My class on Sunday is grown because one of the other classes is going to be invited to join us. So I'm paying attention. Folks are communicating out there. That's absolutely great. The other is I have been in touch with the other folks that are part of our missions agency / board. I don't have a biblical name that I can think of per se off the top that comes off good in Greek, but and so anyway, we have been told that we can do virtual Christ in the Passover, Messiah in the Passover demos. Now, I'm not going anywhere to do those. So here's what I am thinking of doing is streaming this live to Facebook. And what I'd like is, again, I will put the Facebook URL. I'm hoping to call some of the folks who, other than, because I have one viewer here that's part of the community that is part of our support team with Chosen People, a co-worker in that way. But I want to welcome everyone else. And so that's basically what we're going to end up doing is I'm working on, I don't know what the shelves are going to look like for unleavened bread because I know what happened to tomato sauce. So we don't know what's going to happen here. But I'm working on putting that together, having a night where you just join us for a simple demo, invite some of the folks who have not been invited, who are supporters, who may be Facebook attached or have high speed. Uh, I got a dear brother online here is definitely welcome. And then just have folks come and join us. So there's some opportunities here coming up that I didn't even plan. For those folks who join us who are part of the community, I have been given permission to see if I could produce some material that would be useful to the Answers, Chosen People Answers, a website. And so I'm busily working on creating some stuff. Now, writing is not my strong suit, but the director of the site is willing to work with me as far as producing some material that, working with some of the material that I may be able to produce. I'm excited about it. I'm a little overwhelmed because it's almost like the dissertation writing, but not quite. But it's exciting, and I had a great talk with him and really established relationships, so that's exciting. I could use some prayer for that, and I can see other people out there can use some prayer too. So I'm going to encourage that for those that out there that pray for us. Be praying for me creating some briefs for my first brief for the CPM Answers website. I'm trying to use more of these skills in a greater degree with Chosen People and seeing if I can make better use of myself and just serve the ministry board, the missions board, just a little more. So that's where we're at. We're going to be dealing with Singer. As I'm going through my stuff to prepare this, I'm amazed. Michael Brown has dealt with some of this stuff, and Singer continues to produce some of this stuff. I don't know if people pay attention or what, but it's amazing to me that he's using some of the same sorts of things that Michael Brown really trounced. And so it's kind of interesting to me. We're going to go to the Detractors Corner now. You know what that means. I feel like putting the disclaimer up. The opinions are not the opinions of the management, but I'm very big in giving him. Now, I tried to keep the clip short, and you'll notice the neat little cartoon with the bubble. Really, I wanted to get creative, and I can do like the living statue thing with the bubble there, so it looks like, that's what's coming out of my brain. It sort of is, but I wanted to do that, and I'm going to work on throwing a few more of those things in. So we're going to go to the Detractors Corner, and I'm going to let him detract. I am going to put the video up first here, and so I'm going to go just so you can see what our topic is tonight, because I want you on the same page. The charge is essentially that Paul faked or over-exaggerated his credentials in order to gain credibility with his Gentile audience. It's really sad because it's a guy from Brooklyn. I hope he runs into some people that know better, and he actually hears some things that are contrary, but he calls and asks why Paul would fake his credentials to a Gentile audience. Now, I know that Rabbi Singer deliberately probably screens which of these things become posts for him and which things don't. Because I don't think you're necessarily getting the ones he loses. And I don't think you're getting the questions that he doesn't feel real secure with. And fair enough, as you're producing stuff as a polemicist or apologist, you want to look good. But this is a little outrageous. I put a case of slander because if I say that someone's doing something for some motivation and I can't prove that's their motivation and they're doing it, I'm essentially slandering them. And I'm really sort of bothered by slandering people who aren't here to defend themselves. First of all, that's just really not in keeping with ethics for me, but there's something beyond that that I want to kind of hit after we get to that. So I'm going to the Detractors Corner now. You see the little thing up there. That's their studio. And then I'm going to go over here and I'm going to start the Detractors Corner. There'll probably be a few minutes delay as usual, but let's just get that started. And if you're just coming in, you can listen to our detractor for the evening. And then we'll get right to it.
Caller, welcome to the show. Please tell us your name, where you're calling from.
Hello. It's Steve from Brooklyn. How are you?
Hey, Steve. What's up, buddy?
Rabbi Singer had a fascinating class on whether, on Paul's pedigree on his CV of why he's boasting, how he's a Pharisee of Pharisees. So I have a simple question. Who is Paul's audience? If it's the non-Jews, the Greeks and the Romans and whatever Visigoths that lived at the time, then who cares about the fact that he's the student of Gamliel? They don't even know who Gamliel is. If it's the Orthodox Jews, they're going to laugh at him because we see that he is full of drivel. Is he going for the middle-of-the-road Jew that's kind of knows a little bit but doesn't know a lot? Who's his target audience? Thank you. That's my question. Is it clear?
Yep. Very good. Thank you, sir.
Very good. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you later. I'm going to listen to my answer.
Okay,
Thank
brother.
you.
Thanks, man. Bye.
So this is a very good question. No one ever asked me that before. And the answer is very, very clear. Paul, not in all cases, but in almost all cases, is speaking to non-Jews. His interlocutors, meaning the people he's fighting with, are largely Jews who became Christian. We're using the term Christian, although at the time, it's very likely that Paul and Peter did not use that term about themselves, but we see in the Christian Bible that others use that about who we now call Christians. But we're going to use that word Christian because it's conventional. So let's be very clear. Paul is asserting that he's doing this all over the place, very famously in Galatians 1 and in Philippians chapter 3. But Paul is asserting that he was more zealous for the law than his contemporaries. Now, the claim that Paul was a student of Gamliel is one that Paul would never have the audacity to make, because Paul's writings are all in the 50s. And in the 50s, people could check it out, because Rabbi Gamliel was alive in the 50s. Rabbi Gamliel died in the 50s. So if you would make such a claim in the 50s, it's not that everybody could check it out, but it was an outrageous claim. But that claim is made in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is written 80, 85, 90, it's very much later. So therefore, by the time you're at the end of the first century, then you can claim anything you want to. So first of all, Paul, in speaking to the churches that the book of Galatians is addressed to, it's not one church, but it's many churches. He was speaking to non-Jews, people who he had formally converted, churches that he set up. But then when he left, in the interval period, others came in with a different type of gospel. These are the language that Paul uses, and bewitched them, in Paul's view, into believing that you need to keep the law. So Paul is speaking to non-Jews who became Christians. In Philippians, same deal, speaking to non-Jews, former pagans, that's who he's speaking to. So you're asking a big question. Why would these people be interested in the fact that he was a lead Pharisee? Paul is not slow to praise himself. If you read it, Paul is always advancing what a great person he is. And if you don't believe him, ask Paul. He'll admit it himself how fantastic he is. But Paul is always doing this, and he's also degrading other Christians. He's degrading Peter in the same context this time in Galatians 2, that Peter was a big hypocrite. What did it have to do with anything? Nothing. It was to show that what he has is directly from Jesus Christ. And he's a chief Pharisee. He's a top, biggest Pharisee Now, I want to be very clear. The word Pharisee is an anachronism. There are Perushim today. There are people who call themselves that, but you would never hear of them. They live right near where I am. This is one point. We get this out of the way. The word Pharisees is the exact equivalent of Orthodox Jews. So understand, we're just using a different dictionary, but the word Pharisee and the word Orthodox Jew today mean the same exact thing. There's a reason why I raise this very important point to you to bear in mind. So the question is, why would non-Jews who are his audience in these churches, wherever they are around the Mediterranean, in what is today Turkey and so on, why would they be interested in the Pharisees and Orthodox Jews and big rabbis? And the answer is, think about this in our time now. People who are not Jewish are very familiar with what form of Judaism, Orthodox Judaism. I'm not saying every single person on earth knows about us, but we're really, really well known. And it's Orthodox Judaism that people are most familiar with. I'll prove it to you. I'm not here to say anything, cast any aspersion on Reform Jews or conservative. Please don't misread my words. But people are most familiar with the practices of Orthodox Jews.
Okay, resolution looks a little funny, but it could just be my eyeballs tonight, or it could be how we're streaming. But hey, we're still here, and you should be getting me now. One of the comments I found interesting too is that he's going to continue with this same line. Okay, he doesn't really say anything more. Steve starts. I already know Steve's not a believer because he says, Paul's full of dribble. And my question to Steve would be, what do you find that's dribble about him? Because we're going to see he's pretty consistent in every other regard other than some things related to Jesus. But his general thought is consistent within Judaism of the time. We're going to see that from some people, and we're going to look at this. I do not push Acts into the 90s. I think that's a little silly. I think that's a claim he would have to scholarly back up. And see, he never does any of that, which is what's disappointing to me. Can you just say Acts is in the 90s and not back that up? Well, okay, that's not what your topic's about, but you're still making assumptions. Just like you're making assumptions about dribble. We're going to go back to the PowerPoint here and start to assert that. But I wanted you to kind of see what his flavor is. And so, because Orthodox Judaism was the most common kind that would have been known by the world in that day, it's why Paul is flaunting his Orthodox credentials. By the way, it's interesting. He better say something about conservative and Reform Judaism, because if he's going to hold believers to what is Talmud Torah Judaism, then he would have to hold all Jews to what is Talmud Torah Judaism, or he'd have to give me a good reason why my thinking is so far removed from Second Temple Judaism that it can't stand. I'm not talking about modern Judaism. I'm talking about Second Temple Judaism, before the Talmud is completed and before you have the additional layers of Talmud and you have Shulchan Aruch and you have all this other stuff which was not a part of Judaism. So that's just a side note, but I think it's a worthwhile side note to say, okay, equal weights and measures. Tell me why my form of Judaism at the time that it started was less acceptable than, say, Reformed or conservative, and why you find those to be more orthodox. I know some of the things he might say, but I really don't think that they're very compelling to me at all. Let's get back to where we were and leave some of these things alone. I'm going to go ahead and put this where I can see it and where you can see it. We're past the Detractors Corner now. Okay. I'm putting this up, and I'm going to have a problem with this. Do you know for a fact that Paul's stuff, what Paul is doing is is false? I mean, you're witnessing against Paul. You're making claims about his motivations. You're making claims about his general demeanor. And so I really want to say, Rabbi Singer, unless you can prove everything you're saying, including Paul's motivations, as we're going to see, I have a problem with whether you're keeping Torah as far as Paul's concerned. If Paul was sitting in a room with you, could he not then turn to you and say, you know what, according to Exodus 20:16, you're really sort of bearing false witness. You don't understand me at all. I really wish Rabbi Singer would stay away from being a New Testament scholar uh, because I think he makes mistakes with Judaism, but I think this is way outside his ballpark. So here's what he would have to prove to make the statements he's making in my mind. Um, I mean, that logically, that would be required. First, he'd have to demonstrate that Paul misrepresented his credentials. If he's doing that, he'd have to indicate it was willingly. I mean, he's saying there's a reason, there's an intent here why Paul is doing this. And then, you know, supposedly he did this with explicit intent of gaining false credibility. And really, that's sort of based on the idea that he thinks Paul loves himself. We're going to look at Paul's real attitude here. But I find it kind of interesting as I'm listening to Rabbi Singer. Who do I think is the more humble individual when I take Paul's writings as a whole? And so we're going to go ahead and look at some of this stuff tonight. The first thing we're going to do is examine that Paul's statements portray a pride, the pride that Singer accuses him of. And I'm going to make the claim that Paul's statements do not portray the pride which Singer accuses him of. So it's unlikely that he would have pridefully asserted credentials he didn't have. Notice, I don't think it's in Paul's nature for his own sake to assert that. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to examine scholarship which demonstrates Paul's credentials. In fact, one of those things we're going to look at, if this was so falsifiable, is Paul in front of the Sanhedrin. I mean, we're going to look at some of this stuff. Let's look at Paul's humility. This is really hysterical. I mean, is he really the type of guy who's going to posture? 1 Timothy 1:13. He's talking about the time he was an Orthodox Jew, a Peroshim, a Pharisee. It's anarchistic, Peroshim, but the idea is an Orthodox Jew. So he's talking about while he was an Orthodox Jew. Although I was formerly a blasphemer, a prosecutor, and an insolent man, I obtained mercy because I did it ignorantly in unbelief. Calling himself a blasphemer, is that prideful for a Jew to do? I mean, do Orthodox Jews usually walk around saying, hi, I'm a blasphemer? Do they write other Orthodox Jews saying, I'm an insolent man and I'm a blasphemer in order to make themselves look good? I mean, is that really well loved among the Orthodox community? Let's all go be blasphemers. We'll be so much better as Orthodox Jews. I mean, is that the sort of thinking that exists? I've never heard any sort of admissions from Rabbi Singer about his knowledge or ability or his character. Here's a man making New Testament statements that is far from a New Testament scholar. He doesn't seem to reference other scholars, and he's saying Paul's prideful because he calls himself a blasphemer, a persecutor, and an insolent man. Now, I do love that he says he did it ignorant unbelief, and I think that is key. I think there are a lot of Jews who are zealous for God who, in unbelief, ignorantly, are making statements. And maybe what we can say for Rabbi Singer is that he's insolent because he is doing it in unbelief. And maybe we could say Steve is insolent. I love how his stuff's dribble. I don't know how much of Paul's stuff Steve heard, but maybe Steve could say I was an insolent man later because I did so in unbelief. Let's look at another of Paul's statements to see just, how prideful and insanely full of himself, Paul is. Here is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the chief. Okay. I mean, the most prideful claim that you can make as an Orthodox Jew is that you are the chief of sinners. I mean, Orthodox rabbis get up all the time and demote their own piety and say, hi, I am the chief of sinners. Messiah came into the world to save sinners, and I'm the chief sinner. See how proud I am. And the Orthodox community would just say, yeah, hey, I mean, it's definitely prideful to call yourself the chief of sinners. I mean, how dare you take such liberty and exalt yourself so? Now let's talk about another verse here. And let's look at Paul's incredible hubris here. I am the least of the apostles, not worthy to be called apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. Now, someone might say, well, that might go over big in the community because, the Christians weren't well loved as a sect in Judaism at this point. Okay? But he's speaking to a Gentile audience. I mean, that's how you're going to get credibility with a Gentile audience? I'm the least of the apostles because I persecuted you? Yeah, that shows incredible pride. I'm the chief of sinners. I'm a blasphemer and an insolent man. I'm the least of the apostles. I'm so puffed up over myself. So, I think when Rabbi Singer looks at Paul's writings and said he's always exalting himself, either Rabbi Singer is so ignorant of the New Testament to not have read these verses, he's deliberately ignoring these verses, or he just doesn't understand them, and I would recommend he get a decent English translation if he's having trouble with the language here, because this does not match what I'm seeing of Paul. Okay? Let's talk about Paul as a Jewish man. Now, I am going to Dr. Brown, but see, Dr. Brown is quoting Klausner in his book From Jesus to Paul. By the way, if I had some money for some Jewish resources right now, I could see a few that I would be interested in getting and sitting down and reading. But let's look at this quote. He's quoting From Jesus to Paul. We'll see who Klausner is, too, because we don't want any ringers in here, any people who don't know anything. We're looking at real scholarship. Let's get biblical. Let's get scholarly. Let's get honest. Okay? Let's deal in real scholarship with real texts and see if the scholarship supports this. Because the reality is I'm being biblical too. Why are you being more biblical than I? And when you're making statements about a book that you don't even consider part of your canon, I think it would be worthwhile. And if you're making comments about history surrounding these texts, I think scholarship is a good place to look and test your conclusions. Paul lived by Jewish law like any proper Jew. Also, he knew the Old Testament in its Hebrew original and meditated much upon it. Hence, there are Semitisms and Hebrewisms in the language of the epistles, in spite of the richness of their Greek. If Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews and a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee, educated in Jerusalem, and able to make speeches in Hebrew and Aramaic, obviously he was not a Septuagint Jew. Okay? Only, and that's just the same words, a little differently, as various Christian scholars are accustomed to painting him. Now, what scholar Michael Brown is doing is quoting scholar Klausner in his book. So, Rabbi Singer, maybe you just think that Klausner is some sort of ignorant Jewish person who doesn't know anything. Okay. Let's see if Joseph Klausner is stupid and doesn't know anything. I have his dates up here. He taught at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Definitely the place where Jewish dum-dums teach, right? I mean, That's kind of insulting to Hebrew University in Jerusalem, if you think about it. From 1874 to 1958. This isn't new scholarship, per se. Not that it would be wrong. We're going to look at some of that. He was a Jewish historian and professor of Hebrew literature. He is a chief redactor of the Encyclopedia Hebraica. Oh, I mean, the type of guy that wouldn't be able to tell whether Paul's writings were dribble or they reflected Hebrewisms and Hebrew thought and good Hebrew, beautiful Hebrew thought. Hebrew thought influenced by the scriptures. He was awarded, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the prize, Prize for Jewish Thought in 1957. He was awarded the Israel Prize in Jewish Studies in 1982 in recognition of his scholarly achievements. Somebody that wouldn't know Jewish thought and wouldn't be able to analyze Paul's writings. The state of Israel issued a stamp with his picture on it. I haven't seen one with Tovia Singer's picture on it yet, but that's really interesting. So Klausner looks at Paul's writings and says, look, first of all, there are definite Hebrewisms that indicate that he wasn't just your average Jewish person, but he was steeped, knowledgeable, and trained in the scriptures. Interesting. Okay. Now, Ellen Siegel's quoted by Dr. Brown. Now, this is not the way you cite. Okay, I know that, there's some citing problems here, I'm supposed to do this a little differently. I did it pretty much in Turabian, but I wanted to give credit. Now, when Dr. Brown uses a lot of these quotes, he just footnotes them, and I'm going to have to get around this if I do some work that relates to an apologetics type site that CPM is coming up with. And so I will confess that I'm probably not perfect Turabian tonight, but I still want to give you the stuff because I want you to know that even the scholar Michael Brown is doing his research and looking at other scholars. So Dr. Michael Brown, and by the way, you can say Rabbi Dr. Hertz. The late rabbi of England was Rabbi Dr. Hertz. And so he wasn't just, your average temple rabbi deciding to become the polemicist for Judaism. He was well degreed. Now, whether Singer has that or not, he never mentioned those. But let's just say that Dr. Michael Brown has credentials. But he's not just even using his own credentials. He's quoting Alan F. Siegel in his book, Paul the Convert, The Apostolate and Apostasy of Saul the Pharisee. Saul the Pharisee. How interesting. Saul was not a Parashim. He was not a Pharisee according to Tovia Singer, but according to Alan F. Siegel, New Haven, Yale University Press, Paul was a first century Jew. Paul is a trained Pharisee who became an apostle to the Gentiles. There isn't a question in Alan Siegel's mind as a Jewish scholar about this, which is pretty much what Paul's claiming, right? In fact, he mentioned Paul didn't claim being a student of Gamaliel. But interestingly enough, there's no question about him being a Pharisee, at least not in the scholar's mind here. But we need to know who Alan Singer is, because he could be another one of those ringers that we just pulled out of nowhere. So let's see if this man's qualified to discuss these things. Alan F. Siegel, and there's his dates. He died in 2011, so he's no longer with us. He was a scholar of ancient religion specializing in Judaism's relationship to Christianity. He should be more likely to discuss these issues than Singer is. Siegel was a distinguished scholar, author, speaker, self-described as a believing Jew, and a 20th century humanist. I don't know what that meant to Siegel. Okay? But we're going to look at his credentialing, okay? Siegel was an expert in the field of history and religious traditions of Judaism and Christianity of the Roman period. Someone who might be able to analyze these writings and on Semitic languages used in Israel. So he was an expert on how you would write and where Jewish thinking was at that time in history, the time in history that Paul is writing from. Maybe some people feel Paul is dribble because they don't really understand Jewish thought at the time Paul was writing. Maybe they're just ignorant of the fact that Judaism today is not the Judaism of the Second Temple period. And so they're reading their modern Orthodox Judaism biases back into the period when those biases didn't necessarily look the same way. So maybe it's Rabbi Tovia Singer's lack of knowledge about what Pharisees were at the time. I mean, it's possible that he just doesn't know. But Alan F. Siegel is an expert on Semitic languages and the religious traditions of both of these. I don't know, that'd be fun for me to be where I am, but I'm having enough trouble completing what I'm completing, so, and I just turned another year older, so God is not likely to let me do everything I can do, but let's look at him. He was born in Worcestershire, Worcester. I should know better. My wife's got relatives. Worcester, Massachusetts. So I know where that is. I mean, I spent 20 years in Vermont. I know New England, and my son went to Gordon briefly. And he attended Amherst College and got his bachelor's. Okay, cool. He got a master's. That's where I am right now, but he got it from Brandeis University. Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, bachelor in Hebrew letters. So he's a double bachelor. He's got a master's. That's what we read so far. Yale University, master of philosophy and PhD. So he had triple masters and a PhD. That's pretty good. I know what it takes to write a dissertation. If you survive that, you already deserve credit. At the time of his retirement, he was professor emeritus of religion, okay, and then he held a particular seat. He was also professor emeritus of Jewish studies at Barnard College. A congruent appointment as adjunct professor of scripture at Union Theological Seminary, and he taught at Princeton and the University of Toronto. So he's somebody that wouldn't be able to tell whether Paul's stuff was dribble or was the writing that you might see of an educated Pharisee at the time. And what does he say? He says clearly Paul was an educated Pharisee. So we've looked at Klausner, who's an expert. We've looked at Alan Siegel, who's an expert. Let's look at Daniel Bayarin. I've been reading more of Daniel Bayarin's stuff. Now, to get to Daniel Bayarin, I don't have the book, A Radical Jew, Paul and the Politics of Identity. It's another good book. There's so much reading I should be doing. And I have to admit, I've gotten lazy I haven't gotten lazy, but I'm not reading everything. Well, we'll just say that I actually relax in the evening a little bit. But let's look at Daniel Bayarin. Now, I have read the Jewish Gospels by Bayarin, and I have looked on read at least one of Siegel's papers on the two powers. So I'm not keeping up. I'm just not keeping up to the same level I could be keeping up. But I am doing the work, and I'm doing the study because I want these to be good. I'm just kind of a guy that always sees that I could be doing a little more. And, you get older and your bedtime starts getting a little earlier unless you're out witnessing. And then it's coffee time and praying for good conversations. Let's look at Daniel Bayarin, Talmudic and Aramaic scholar, Daniel Bayarin. Now, what does he say about Paul? Paul has left an extremely precious document for Jewish studies. Wow. A spiritual autobiography of a first century Jew. Wow. Moreover, if we take Paul at his word, we see no priori reason not to. He was a member of the Pharisaic wing of first century Judaism. Let's get to what this means. And by the way, I do someone had made a comment. I do love studying, and I want to increase my learning. And so that's why I'm excited. I learn most when I'm teaching or if I'm preparing materials. So this new possibility that's opened up is going to teach me a whole lot as I put things together. So I'm excited about it. Okay, now again, Dr. Michael Brown is doing us the favor of getting a hold of this book that I just don't have in my library. You know? So that's where we're at. What does he say? Now, it's interesting. He says, if we take Paul at his word, and I see no a priori reason not to. In other words, he can't find a reason for not thinking Paul's a Pharisee. Unlike the gentleman who called into Rabbi Singer. And he's a scholar, and I haven't heard Rabbi Singer bring up the same credentials, and I don't think Steve from Brooklyn necessarily has them. So, Dr. Michael Brown's quoting Klausner again. Now, we've seen he's a scholar. It would be difficult. I want you to hear these words from Klausner. And we already know that he's a bang-up guy who knows his stuff. Okay? It would be difficult to find a more Talmudic it'd be difficult to find more typically Talmudic expositions of Scripture than used in the epistles of Paul. Now, what is he saying here? He's saying this is the type of thinking of Jewish sages and scholars, and you're seeing it in Paul's epistles, and it's typical Talmudic exposition of Scripture. In other words, Paul writes like an Orthodox, extremely educated, okay, extremely sophisticated, educated Jewish scholar of the time. Now, I'm just going to the PowerPoint real quickly here just to kind of see where we're at, because I kind of want to make sure that we don't go too far. And I'm going to go here. There we go. Now, some people would object on the basis of the fact that Paul makes a lot of use of the Septuagint, and they would go ahead and say that Paul's use of the Septuagint would indicate that he was not such a Hebrew scholar. If he was really a Pharisee of the time period, he would make use of the Hebrew scriptures more exclusively, and he would not make use of the Septuagint. In other words, he'd refer back to the Hebrew texts. And so this is a typical sort of argument that you might get. And I'm going to bring that up a little bit so you can see it better. So here's where we're at. Now, first of all, Paul is writing to a Gentile audience. Let's remember who he's speaking to here. A Gentile audience was not necessarily going to be as familiar with the Hebrew scriptures in Hebrew. So we got to kind of be clear about that. He's writing to a Gentile audience. It's going to be their first language. And so that's kind of why that's there. But let's talk a little bit about this. C.F. Hengel, in his book, The Septuagint as Christian Scripture, makes some comments related to this and related to Paul's use of the Septuagint. Second, he did not always follow the Septuagint, despite the fact that he was writing to a Gentile audience who used the Septuagint exclusively. So Paul is the he here. He didn't always follow the Septuagint, despite the fact that he was writing. So although Paul makes a lot of use of the Septuagint, given that he's writing a Gentile audience, even then, he doesn't make exclusive use of the Septuagint. Okay, and they wouldn't have had access to other translations. The most profound example is found in his quotation of Habakkuk 2, the righteous shall live by faith. You're going to see that in Galatians 3:11 and Romans 1:17. A foundational text for Paul, but one where he does not follow the Subto. So Paul, using this foundational verse, does not use the Subto, even though he's talking to a Gentile audience that would only know the Subto. Third, some Subto, that's what that X, the LXX is. It's just the word for 70, which is where the word for Subto comes from. And it's because it was done by 70 Jewish scholars. And there's a whole history behind the Subto, how the Jewish community feels about the Subto. Some Subto scholars have observed upon careful examination in roughly half of the cases involved where he's using the Subto, approximately 50 out of 100, Paul does not follow the Subto exactly when he cites it, which suggests that he was involved in a revision of the text based on the Hebrew. Now, what this person's saying here, let me unpack this for you a little bit, is that Paul changes the Septuagintal translation a little bit to better reflect the Hebrew in 50% of the cases where he does use the Septuagint at all. This is not a man unacquainted with the Hebrew Scriptures. That's what we should get out of this. That such a statement is just not in keeping with what we're seeing in Paul's writings. It's not the way it is. Now, here's the funniest one of all. Paul in front of the Jewish Supreme Court, the Septuagint. I love this. This would have occurred during the time when Gamaliel would have been alive. Remember? Singer makes a big point about how verifiable this is, and this is why Paul doesn't say it, because it could have been checked. So let's see what the Jewish Supreme Court does with this. Saul, this is before he was converted, but it's the same human being, okay? We're not talking about someone who's a different human being. Saul was still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord and went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, knowing that the high priest would have had pure access to Paul's credentials and would have known that he was a liar misrepresenting himself. Interesting. So that if he found any who were of the way, those would be believers or followers of Messiah. I have news for you. One, that there was a time when that term wasn't tainted, because Jesus called himself the way. I'm sorry it got tainted. Because Satan is always stealing terms from us, and I really don't like it. Whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem, and he journeyed near Damascus, and this is his conversion story. Now, you know, if Paul was lying about his credentials, it would have started before he was a Christian. You know, who did he introduce himself as is the question. Okay, but let's talk about the time he's on trial. I like this. Paul perceived, being in front of the Jewish Supreme Court, that part were Sadducees and part were Pharisees, and he cried out in the chamber, men and brethren, I am the Pharisee, son of a Pharisee. By the way, in the Greek, ego eimi Pharisaios. Now, what that means is his present tense. So Paul is still calling himself a Pharisee after being a believer. Okay, which is really interesting. And he's in front of the Jewish Supreme Court, and he says, I am a Peroshim. I'm an Orthodox Jew, the son of an Orthodox Jew. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being tried. And they say to him, Paul, you're a filthy liar. We know well that you are just teaching dribble, and you are not a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and you know nothing about it, because you are ignorant and a liar. And you are just saying that. I don't see that in the text. Now, even if it isn't in the text, why didn't they just say that to everyone else? Hey, look, Luke forgot to record that the Sanhedrin blasts him for lying. But Luke is okay with the fact that Paul is clearly lying. Why didn't the Supreme Court just say, we tried this man, found him guilty of a false witness, misrepresenting himself, and we have him dead to rights because we talked to Gamaliel personally, and anything you're getting about this guy, it's all lies, but none of that's there, and there's nothing recorded. Even in the Talmud, I don't know of a single verse that says Paul represented himself, and when he was tried before the Pharisees, they found him guilty of misrepresentation of himself. In fact, let's go on with this. Now, this is a recorded session of the Sanhedrin. It wasn't recorded by Jews, but Paul knows what was said there, and they could have repudiated Paul's credentials, and they had the dead rights. I mean, this is the Gamaliel here who stands up and says, leave the believers alone. If their movement's not of God, it'll come to nothing anyway. Earlier in Acts, when he said this, a dissension rose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Well, why did that happen? For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection. Remember, he said, for the hope and resurrection of the dead, and no angel or no spirit, but the Pharisees confess them both. By the way, that's why you'll find Jesus very more friendly towards the Pharisees as far as doctrine than the Sadducees. Jesus' problem with the Pharisees was more their practice. Jesus' problem with the Sadducees is they were just dead wrong about some things that were pretty important. And there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party rose and protested, saying, look at this. We find no evil in this man. If a spirit or angel spoke to him, let us not fight against God. But we know he's lying about his credentials, and he doesn't know anything about his Bible, and he's not really a Pharisee. But we find no evil in this man. He just claimed in front of the Jewish Supreme Court, which it would have been considered perjury of the highest quality, to go ahead and say that if it weren't true. And they have every reason to check him out. And he already dealt with the high priest and got letters from that high priest. Do you think that high priest didn't know where he came from? Didn't ask who he was credentialed by, who he was taught by, or anything? Is that really reasonable to assume that? I'm having problems with this if the Supreme Court says so. But Paul's still kind of a braggart, right? I mean, let's, look at this. Well, here's the thing. Paul is not being a braggart. Paul is on the defense. Now, Rabbi Singer sort of says that, but then he says, but, Paul loved himself so much. But other people came in and preached a different gospel. Did it ever occur to Rabbi Singer that it was the message he was concerned about? And he was worried about an attack on that message? Well, let's see here. Okay? Have I become a fool in boasting? You have compelled me. I ought to have been commended by you, for in nothing was I left behind the most eminent apostles. Though I am nothing, also the comment of a really prideful man. Truly, the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you in all perseverance, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. For what is it in which you were inferior to other churches, except that I was not burdensome to you? Forgive me this wrong. Okay? So Paul's saying, look, the only reason that I even bother to mention and boast about my credentials is because I am defending this message, and this message is being attacked. And so in order to defend the gospel, the message of Messiah, I am willing to go to the extreme of boasting and using my credentials to glorify or verify him, not to draw attention to myself as far as my worth and goodness. Okay, now look at this. This is like absolutely great. Galatians 6, 13 and 14, for even those who are circumcised, and actually it should say do not keep the law. I don't know why that did that. Okay, do not keep the law, which is what I would say to Rabbi Singer. You're going to boast about your law keeping. Do you keep Torah perfectly? But they desire to have you circumcised that they may boast in your flesh. God forbid. Now look at this. This is, the statement of a really prideful guy. God forbid that I should boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. To what extent does Paul boast? Not for his own sake to bolster himself, but to give credibility and deflect the attack on the message of the gospel. Paul isn't doing this for Paul's sake, which is what I would expect of a prideful man. It's what I'd expect of somebody who was boasting about himself. So let's look at this. Paul doesn't exhibit the pride that Singer seems to indicate. We've looked at statements and we've looked at the reason for Paul's boasting. Jewish scholarship, not Gentile scholarship alone, Jewish scholarship affirms Paul's credentials as an educated Jewish man who was a Pharisee. And somebody rightly pointed out something very good. He misconstrued Paul's confrontation with Peter. Yes, because he doesn't get it. Paul's discussion of his credentials was prompted by his critics in order to discredit him or them the way that Rabbi Singer is discrediting him. But the goal was to uphold his credentials for the sake of the message of Messiah. Paul's chief concern is Messiah and his message. And Singer is totally ignoring that. If you want to say that Paul is a heretic, go ahead and say that. By the way, I don't even accept apostate, because Paul was within the framework of Judaism at the time. When I've been challenged, someone said to me, Jeff, you're apostate. I'd say no. Actually, according to rabbinical Judaism, you'd have to call me a heretic. So let's get it right. But I'd say, no, you can't call me an apostate. You can call me a heretic. In the sense that the central tenets of Judaism that are biblical, I still find to be biblical. I haven't changed my mind about the Old Testament, what it says. I just view it through the lens of Messiah, which, by the way, also was in keeping with some folks in the Second Temple period. So that's where we're kind of at. Now, I do want to see, people are telling me how they're doing, and I am definitely concerned. I hope you found this worthwhile tonight and useful. Hit the like button. Again, I will put up the YouTube. Well, I may wait a little bit, but I'm going to put up that Facebook. Well, let me try and do that right now. Let me see if I can go here. I'm still broadcasting, but I think I can do this. This is going to try to pull a hat trick here. Put the URL up for my website so that those who want to see you want to join us for Sunday school, you're free to do that. I welcome that. There's that. So if you are quarantined and you are not listening to another service or something, you can use that. I'll be broadcasting roughly at about 10:30. We'll be doing our Sunday school class, and I welcome any of you joining. You could put questions in the comment section on Facebook. You can't do it the same way as YouTube. Okay. So that's where we're kind of at for tonight. Now I don't have the dreaded virus, but I do have a little bit of my sinuses. I've been outside and my sinuses are bothering me just a little bit tonight. So I think we're gonna kind of wrap up. I thank you, everybody. I can't type fast enough to keep track of all you cool people. Radical Love, Steve. I can't tell you what you mean to me. Why don't I close with praying? Again, I always feel funny, but hey, look. During these times, if YouTube wants to pull my video for praying about the coronavirus, then I'll just take it on the chin. Okay. Thanks for all the happy birthdays. It happened on the 16th of March, but we've been so busy with the virus and my spring tour being canceled and dealing with everything else. So just to let you know, I really appreciate the happy birthdays. I am now a year older. Hopefully I will become a year wiser. Lord, thank you so much for our community. Thank you for any people who are going to see this after. I pray people would see this after. I pray some of the people that are following I'm going to call it it. I'm just going to call it stuff by Rabbi Singer. I don't want to be ad hominem. I really pray that they would see some of this stuff, that some people would. We've had a few folks react to it, and I really pray that it would get out there, and I pray that it would be useful to the folks who tuned in, and even the ones that are going to tune in. I thank you for the new subscribers that I'm seeing on the channel. Guys, we're making it to the next milestone. Um, Lord, I just talked to them instead of talking to you. I'm grateful, Lord, that we're seeing more subscribers, that we're making it almost to the next milestone. We're almost there. Slow but steady. You know me, I'm kind of a plotter. I'm kind of a William Carey kind of guy, and we'll just plod along. And I'm so grateful that you're bringing some more subscribers and some more people to see stuff. And it's just you getting your stuff out there that you're going to be able to use. I pray about the coronavirus. I really need to get off the subject of the video and talk to you about the coronavirus. There are people that have lost jobs. They're laid off. I mean, we're experiencing that in our household. This is a hard time for people. Then there's the quarantining, and then that's really hard, and their body's not meeting together. And then there's the challenge of ministry and evangelism, and I can't even name everything. And then there's people who could get it. All these dear folks that are part of the community here, some of them may be at risk. I don't know what pre-existing conditions are out there. I just pray that you'd see us through this time. Start to show us the light at the end of the tunnel. May we remember that we look unto the hills from whence comes our help. Our help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, and that he will not suffer our foot to slip. He that keeps Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. And so you are there for us. And I really pray that you would be with these dear ones as they go through all of this. I'm excited because you can get this stuff out even with the coronavirus. Your gospel is not stopped. Apologetics is not stopped. Giving a winsome answer for our faith has not stopped. Your word is not stopped. Preachers are still preaching. They are not stopped. Sunday schools are still going on. They are not stopped. People are getting saved. You are not stopped by this, and I'm so grateful for that. May you bless these ones who joined us. Keep them safe. Keep them healthy. Be with them. We can be community even though we can't be together because you are not stopped, and so we are not stopped. And I bring these things before you in Jesus' precious name. By his authority, I approach your throne, knowing that you allow us to share in his authority until the end of the age. Amen. I'm just going to